Well, here we are. We're going to talk a little bit about what it looks like for Christians to be thoughtfully engaged in the city. And for that to happen, we have to be thoughtfully engaged in culture. And one thing that's really helpful is to have some sort of shared definition as we enter into this conversation. And there are tons out there when it comes to definitions of culture. But one that's been most helpful for me is from a gentleman by the name of Andy Crouch. Great guy. Love him. He does some really thoughtful work. And the way he describes culture in a really pithy way is culture is what we make of the world, and then simultaneously how we make sense of the world. And as Christians, right, we come from a lens of the gospel, what God has done through Jesus, and that shapes then a little bit differently how we go about shaping things in the world and how we make sense of the world.
Yeah, and we're here right now in the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum, which in and of itself is telling a story for the world. You know, its mission started, oh goodness, back in the 1990s. Folks recognized that this is the space that the Negro Leagues began, and they wanted to capture that story of overcoming. The story of men and women involved, and how they transformed the sport. That's when night baseball began.
That's
but
right.
also transformed our culture, and not just our culture, but in their own way, the world itself, which is a spectacular mission, and it's really a spectacular story and a great example of what you're talking about.
Yeah, and this is anchored right here in Scripture. This is not something new. This is not something novel. But as people who want to know and follow what God has called us to, and specifically how that comes to clarity and fruition in Jesus, this is anchored all the way back in the beginning in the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 1, the cultural mandate.
Okay.
Yeah.
What's the cultural mandate?
So the cultural mandate is when God makes the first two human beings and he tells them to go and be fruitful and to multiply. So take my good world and make something beautiful of it. In other words, make something of the world and shape what you make sense of the world in a way that honors me.
But all of humanity.
Yeah, this is so
Critical.
So it starts right here in the beginning, like this purpose statement for humanity in Genesis with all these raw materials. And then you go to the other bookend, the book of Revelation, and you come to where all of these raw materials now reach a climax in the New Jerusalem. What was gold and these precious metals that were there in the garden now are jewels, and this brilliant architecture of the New Jerusalem coming down, culture perfected by God's work in the world. And then simultaneously you have this picture of the kings who come and bring their cultural goods into the New Jerusalem. That, you know, I've heard Andy Crouch brilliantly say that culture is kind of like the furniture of heaven. And for us, that's a good reminder of how culture is simultaneously the work here on earth.
For me, understanding and hearing the cultural mandate was life-changing. Life-changing, because it was really when I was an adult. I'd already been working in the arts, doing art, and a friend of mine began to talk to me about the cultural mandate. I started reading it, showing it to me, and it put words to what was going on in my heart. It put action to my belief in ministry. And to understand that the cultural mandate was given to all of humanity helped me to understand the redemptive mandate given to us in Matthew. So for me, it was life-changing.
That's spectacular. Yeah, and it's not just for the Christian to be engaged. I think
That's the beauty,
isn't it? There's something about the fiber in our beings to create, you know, and there's something that just sings of creation in some way. I mean, even those who don't necessarily know the God of this Bible, you know, the Egyptian pyramids, the all of, you know, you go walking through the Nelson Atkins Art Museum, and there is just art that speaks and moves your heart.
That is created by people who don't equate with our God.
Right.
But
Absolutely.
their work is very kingdom mindset.
And being all involved is wonderful.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, and Leanne, let's zero in a little bit. I mean, you are a gifted artist. You're someone who teaches art to children and simultaneously comes alongside of emerging artists to help them live into their calling. So when we think about this cultural mandate, the call for all human beings, and then especially those who long to follow Jesus, to engage culture, what does that have to say about our engagement in the arts?
Yeah, well, it says a lot.
To say the least, yeah, right?
To say the least. I mean, you know, instead of criticizing art, engage with it. You know, it talks about, you know, sitting before it, listening, hearing what it has to say. But for an artist, I think in our culture, typically in our Christian culture, we have separated the secular and the sacred. And we've made this divide. But really what I'm trying to help young artists of faith is to understand that these two worlds integrate, and we live no secular sacred divide. And so I want to encourage artists of faith to create excellent art, create an excellent walk with God, and do this in the mainstream art culture. Don't pull yourself out into your own subculture of art, but be a part of what's happening. Be a part of Hollywood. Be a part of the art happening in New York and around the world. Be a part of it, because that's what's going to transform culture. And when people poo-poo the arts, I say, my gosh, the arts impact all of us. Do you read magazines? Do you look at TV? Do you watch commercials? I mean, just it's everywhere. Do you read books? All of this, the arts are everywhere. So
yeah, and how can you begin to engage someone else and their story without doing that? How can you begin to understand who they are? And that's part of who I think we're called to be as Christians. Yeah, that's a great.
And speaking of story, Laura, let's think about your work and how.
Which is not art at all, because I can do stick figures and that's about it.
You're not alone, but.
But it's a part of art.
Yeah,
It
there we
is.
go. There we go. So, but thinking of, I mean, but the
I know the difference
national.
between Grandma Moses and Mother Jones.
Grandma Joseph, she's great. Moses.
That's
Grandma
right.
Moses.
That's right. Brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
And when you think about the art of the National World War I Museum and Memorial,
Yeah.
I mean, it is absolutely beautiful. And when you think about
Yes.
your work, okay,
Yeah.
when you're thinking about your work in this call to engage culture, what does that look like for you? What does that inform for the rest of the world and those who seek to follow Jesus?
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, I engage culture from a historic perspective. You know, it is some of these cultural institutions that we are just blessed with here in Kansas City aren't just about capturing music like the American Jazz Museum and some of the physical arts like the Nelson Atkins, but capturing history and the humanities like the Negro Leagues Baseball Museum and the National World War I Museum and Memorial and the Steamboat Arabia and the Truman Presidential Library. And that in and of itself is such an incredible and essential part of culture, our story, what brought us from this moment to where we are today. Understanding that helps us be better prepared for our present and to hopefully make better decisions. It also can inspire us. You know, if we are lucky, God willing, we're never going to have any experience like those men and women who lived through and those who died during the World War, but we can be inspired by that. We can see part of God's redemptive work in that. We can recognize how similar those men and women were to us. And that is, I think, so essential. Not only looking at the cultural history, but also engaging in those humanities and looking at different cultures, looking at the world through a lens that's not my own. I am never going to be a good baseball player, nor an African-American man. However, going through this museum, I can understand some of that story better. And not only that, I get the opportunity to work with some incredible professionals who live out their daily lives telling that story, and I have a little bit of a better perspective and can engage in spaces in a better way, and also get the chance to be really proud of our city, because that's, I think, something else that, you know, we've been talking about in engaging the city.
Right. And I know both of you have so much that I consistently want to learn from, and we could actually spend all afternoon. We have done that. We have spent quite a bit of time together chatting through this topic. And but here, boil it down to 60 seconds or less. 60 seconds or less. What's the one thing you would charge every Christian when it comes to engaging, creating, critiquing culture?
Well, I would say don't make it so hard. You know, live right where God has you. Be live out of who God has made you to be, and engage in culture. And make it simple. Be who God has made you to be, and live out of that. And don't just consume the culture, but live out of who you are and engage it.
To say one of the things that I do when I lead programs at the museum, we're actually in a war against our couches right now. It is not just
that's
about,
true.
yeah, it is about
You don't
getting,
have to leave.
yeah, get
Right.
people off of the couches. So
Right.
I love what you said there of get engaged in the community. Wherever you are, if you are
Right.
out in a rural space, a suburban space, the urban space,
Exactly.
get engaged.
Right.
And then I'm gonna maybe push back or not on that and also say, follow that with your physical presence, with also your dollar. I work at a space.
I agree with that,
Yeah,
actually. Yeah.
I work at a space where we have said we're going to keep artifacts until literally that last page that you just said. Accessioning an artifact just means we're keeping it till the end of time, and it is because of the generosity and the civic mindedness of Kansas Cityans that the National World War I Museum and Memorial exists.
Well,
and
I mean, I would say that Christians, above all, should be the best patrons of culture, the best patrons of the arts. So, yes, that means your dollar.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so when you bring all of that together, brilliant advice, don't make it so hard, and then simultaneously go places and do all of this and bring together this brilliant combination of what we do with the world and how we make sense of the world through the gospel is something so rich, so powerful, and may it glorify our good God.
Amen.
Yeah, and
Thank
I
you.
say, and come to the 4-chapter gallery.
There you go, and come to the 4-chapter gallery. Well, thank you so
On
much.
brand today. I like it.
Love you both so much. Thanks for your time. Oh, this has been
Thanks
a
for
treat.
inviting us.
Yeah.